For 11 years, my brother stood on stages accepting applause for a company I built with my own two hands. He signed autographs on magazine covers that should have had my name on them. And then, one Tuesday morning, I walked into his boardroom with a folder full of documents he thought had vanished years ago, and by lunchtime, his entire empire started coming apart in front of the very people who worshipped him. Before I get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if stories about family betrayal and quiet justice speak to you, hit subscribe. There's more coming. My name is Sienna Voss, and here's the thing about how my brother took my company away from me. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, in tiny pieces, spread out over more than a decade, until even I started questioning whether anything I'd done had ever really counted. 11 years ago, my brother Dane and I were sharing a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Denver, both broke, both desperate for something to work out. I spent my nights working warehouse shifts, and in whatever hours I had left, I taught myself to build logistics software from the ground up. Dane didn't know the first thing about code or supply chains or operational systems. What Dane had was charisma. He could walk into a room of strangers and walk out 20 minutes later with all of them believing he was the smartest person there. In those early days, I honestly thought we were partners. I handled the technical side, and he handled the people. That felt like a reasonable split at the time. I stayed hunched over my laptop building the product while he went out and found people willing to invest in us. Then the money started rolling in, and something shifted. Every investor meeting seemed to circle back to the same questions. Who's the face of this company? Who's the visionary? Who do we trust with our money? And somehow, every single time, Dane became the founder, and I became invisible. When I brought it up, he always had an answer ready. He'd say it was temporary, that appearances mattered in the beginning, that once we were stable, he'd make sure everyone knew the truth about who actually built the system running underneath it all. I believed him because he was my brother. That trust turned out to be the most expensive decision of my life. The company, we called it Meridian Freight Solutions, grew faster than either of us expected. What started as a scrappy piece of software soon became a logistics operation, managing distribution contracts across a dozen states. Executives who used to ignore our calls were suddenly begging for meetings. Business magazines started calling Dane a rising star. Success changed him almost overnight. He traded his old hoodies for custom suits. He joined private clubs, showed up to galas every weekend, learned the smooth investor speak that made rooms lean in. The more attention he got, the more he needed it. While Dane built his image, I stayed buried in the actual work. When a client's shipping system crashed at 3 a.m., I was the one fixing it. When a six-figure contract nearly fell apart, I was the one on the phone until sunrise saving it. When employees threatened to walk out because Dane dismissed their concerns, I was the one talking them into staying. I absorbed pressure from every direction while somebody else took the credit for the results. None of that ever made it into public view. At conferences, Dane introduced me as his operations assistant, sometimes just support staff, like I organized calendars instead of running the systems that kept the entire company alive. I let it slide because he kept feeding me the same promise, just a little longer, and he'd tell everyone the truth. Instead, the story he told just kept growing. In interviews, he described nights he never spent building anything, recycling ideas straight out of notebooks I'd filled years earlier. He even framed pages of my original design sketches and hung them in his office like decorative trophies of his early vision. Guests admired them constantly, never knowing whose handwriting filled every page. The worst part wasn't the lying. It was watching everyone believe it without a second thought. Eventually, employees stopped seeing me as someone who mattered. New hires assumed I only stuck around because Dane was my brother, never realizing I'd built the infrastructure they relied on every single day. The longer I stayed quiet, the more permanent his rewritten history became. I started to feel like a ghost inside the company I'd created. My parents didn't help. Growing up, Dane was always the golden child, confident, athletic, magnetic. I was the quiet one who preferred solving problems to working a room. That pattern followed us into adulthood. Once Meridian took off, my mother called Dane a visionary to anyone who'd listen, hung his magazine spreads in the living room, quoted his interviews at dinner parties. When someone asked about me, the answer always shrank down to something small. Sienna helps him with the technical stuff, she'd say, helps him. I was the one who wrote the software that launched the company, designed every operational system, solved every distribution crisis, carried the business through problems Dane didn't even understand, and somehow my role became helping. I used to correct people. After years of hearing the same story repeated by everyone around me, I stopped bothering. Then Dane married Marissa. She was polished, sharp, and it took her about 3 weeks to figure out exactly how fragile Dane's confidence really was underneath the suits. His whole identity depended on people believing he was the genius behind Meridian. Instead of challenging that, she leaned into it, because their entire lifestyle, the vacations, the house, the galas, depended on the illusion holding. At a family dinner one night, someone brought up the company's upcoming anniversary event. Marissa laughed into her wine glass and said, "Sienna's basically the company mascot at this point." The table laughed. Even Dane smiled. That was the moment something in me finally shifted. Not because the comment was cruel, but because I understood with total clarity that my brother had no intention of ever giving me credit. My invisibility wasn't an accident anymore. It was necessary for the life he wanted. Here's what nobody at that table understood. Nearly every contract keeping Meridian alive existed because of me. Dane was brilliant at first impressions. He could charm a room and sell a dream better than anyone I've ever met. But once clients moved past the pitch and started asking hard questions about fulfillment systems and distribution failures, he had nothing. That's when the call always came to me. Quietly, without recognition, I became the person every major client actually trusted. I handled the 2 a.m. emergencies. I rebuilt relationships with accounts that were one bad week from walking. Some weeks I barely slept, because I was rewriting broken logistics plans to prevent losses in the millions. While Dane was off giving interviews about his vision, most executives assumed Dane was solving these problems himself because he made absolutely sure they never saw me doing it. He'd forward my emails from his own account, so ideas looked like they came from him. He'd walk into meetings after I'd already fixed everything and present my solutions as his strategy. At one point, he told his assistant to leave me off executive correspondence unless it was unavoidable. Decisions about the company I built were being made around me, in rooms I wasn't even told about. Still, I stayed. Part of me loved what we'd built and didn't want to blow it up. Part of me was scared that exposing him publicly would destroy everything. So I told myself protecting the business mattered more than protecting myself. Then Marcus Wren came into the picture. Marcus ran one of the largest retail supply chains in the country, and landing his partnership changed everything for Meridian overnight: national credibility, enormous revenue, doors we never imagined opening. Dane spent years telling the story of how he personally won Marcus over. That story was fiction. After their very first meeting, Marcus privately told me he never wanted to sit across from Dane again. He found him careless and unreliable. From that point on, every real conversation happened through me. Contract terms, crisis calls, long-term strategy, all of it stayed between me and Marcus. while Dane kept collecting the credit in public. Everything came to a head at Meridian's 11th anniversary gala. Picture a downtown hotel ballroom packed with investors, executives, reporters, longtime clients, giant screens looping photos of Dane shaking hands with people twice his importance. The entire night was a monument to the story he'd spent a decade building. I stood near the back, exactly where everyone expected me to be. Dane gave another polished speech about sacrifice and building something from nothing. The room ate it up. Then his eyes found me in the back, and I actually thought, for one embarrassing second, that he was finally about to acknowledge me. Instead, he smiled into the microphone and said, "People assume Sienna helped build this company because she's my sister. Honestly, she'd probably still be fixing office printers somewhere if I hadn't brought her in." The ballroom exploded with laughter. I stood completely still while it washed over me. Strangers laughed because they thought it was harmless. Executives laughed because they wanted his approval. A few employees looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet anyway. What broke me wasn't the joke. It was the look on Dane's face right after pure relief. Relief that the room accepted his version of reality without a single question. Relief that after 11 years, nobody doubted him. I understood something in that moment I'd been avoiding for a long time. My brother wasn't protecting the company's image anymore. He needed me to be small because his entire identity depended on it. I left before the applause even finished. That night I dug a storage box out of the back of my closet, one I'd avoided touching for years. Inside were the earliest incorporation filings, original software designs in my own handwriting, contracts tied to the systems I built, archived emails discussing development decisions. Even old messages from Dane admitting flat out that the company wouldn't exist without me. I sat on my floor for hours reading through all of it, and for the first time I let myself admit the truth. I hadn't stayed silent to protect the business. I'd stayed silent protecting the person who was slowly erasing me. But what I found in that box next was something I hadn't expected at all, something Dane had completely forgotten about. Years earlier, before investors, before offices, before any of the publicity, Dane's terrible credit history had caused legal headaches during the company's earliest paperwork. Lawyers at the time suggested certain protections be temporarily filed under my name instead, just to keep things moving. Dane signed without really reading, the way he treated most paperwork back then, an inconvenience standing between him and the next meeting. He assumed it was a technicality that would quietly disappear once the company grew. It never did. Through years of restructuring, new investors and ownership shuffles, one original clause tied to those earliest filings never got fully removed, and that clause was tied directly to me. I couldn't quite believe it myself, so I gathered every document I had and booked a meeting with a corporate attorney named Owen Pratt, someone with a reputation for untangling exactly this kind of mess. I genuinely expected him to tell me it was nothing. Too much time had passed, too much had changed. Instead, he spent hours going through contracts, amendments, and filings, getting quieter with every page. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me carefully. "Sienna," he said, "your brother might be the public face of Meridian, but legally you still control this company." I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt sick. Because I suddenly understood exactly how fragile Dane's entire world really was: the mansions, the interviews, the investor relationships, all of it built on a foundation he never even bothered to understand. For 11 years, I thought he'd stolen my identity. Now, I realized he'd built his whole life on top of a lie that could collapse the second someone pulled the right document. Part of me still wanted to protect him, but for the first time in over a decade, I stopped feeling guilty about the idea of fighting back. If I'd known what was about to happen in that boardroom 3 weeks later, I might have braced myself differently, but nothing could have really prepared me for it. Rumors started spreading through the executive floor that Marcus Wren was about to walk away from the partnership entirely. Investors panicked. Senior managers demanded answers. Dane called an emergency board meeting to get ahead of it before things spiraled. What nobody in that building knew was that the rumors were completely true. Marcus was done pretending Dane mattered more than the people actually keeping the business running. The morning of the meeting, I walked into headquarters in a plain black suit, carrying a folder I'd spent days organizing. Conversations went quiet the moment I stepped onto the executive floor. Some people looked confused to see me there. Others avoided eye contact entirely. When Dane saw me walk into the boardroom, his face went hard immediately. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. "I'm attending the meeting," I said calmly. "You don't work in executive operations." Before I could answer, Marissa leaned back with a smug little smile and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "She really can't let go of the company, can she?" A few people laughed quietly. For 1 second, I almost walked out. My chest was tight, and the old familiar humiliation was creeping back in. But then I thought about every overnight crisis I'd solved, every contract I'd saved, every time Dane took credit for work he never touched. So instead of leaving, I walked to the end of the table and sat down. The meeting started. Dane launched into a rehearsed speech about market instability and declining margins. Then, predictably, the conversation turned to blame. Within minutes, he was talking about internal inefficiencies, and everyone in the room understood exactly who he meant. He went as far as calling me emotionally unstable in front of executives I'd worked beside for years. That's the exact moment the boardroom doors opened. Marcus Wren walked in and the entire room stood up automatically. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even Dane's aggressive tone vanished. He forced a smile and stuck out his hand. "Marcus, glad you made it." Marcus walked straight past him and looked at me instead. "Sienna," he said, "good to see you." The silence that followed was almost physical. Dane let out a nervous laugh. "You two know each other." Marcus didn't even look at him. "She's negotiated every contract we've ever signed with this company," he said flatly. I watched confusion ripple around the table. People started connecting things that had never made sense before. Marcus kept going. "For years, your sister has handled every operational crisis tied to our account. She solved problems your leadership team couldn't touch. Frankly, most of us assumed everyone in this building already knew who was actually running things." The color drained from Dane's face. Then Marcus set a thick folder down on the table, and the sound cracked through the silence. Inside were years of communication records, contract revisions, negotiation histories, emergency planning documents, all tied directly to me. My name was on every page. Everything Dane claimed as his own had never actually belonged to him. Executives started flipping through it in a panic. Legal advisors whispered near the windows. One board member just stared at Dane like he was seeing him for the first time. Marcus wasn't finished. "My company will not renew a single contract with Meridian," he said, "unless Sienna Voss becomes CEO effective immediately." The room froze completely. 11 years of careful image building started collapsing in front of the exact people Dane had spent his whole career trying to impress. What happened next was chaos. Attorneys huddled by the windows. Investors demanded answers about ownership structures that suddenly didn't add up. Dane's composure, the thing he'd spent a decade perfecting, fell apart in real time. First, he accused me of betrayal. Then he claimed I was jealous and trying to destroy the company out of resentment. He even suggested Marcus had been manipulated against him. Nobody argued with him. Nobody defended him either. The silence said everything. Then the doors opened again, and Owen Pratt walked in with another stack of documents. He introduced himself calmly as legal counsel representing the original ownership filings, and the room's attention shifted instantly. He walked the board through it, how the earliest company protections had been filed under my name years earlier because of Dane's financial troubles, and how every restructuring since had never actually removed the controlling clause tied to those original filings. Legally, control of the company had been mine the entire time. You could have heard a pin drop. Dane just stared at Owen like he was speaking a different language. "This can't be real," he kept repeating. But the signatures were real. The paperwork was real. Across the table, Marissa's expression wasn't devastated, it was terrified. She understood immediately what this meant. Without Meridian, the lifestyle disappeared with it. The board called an emergency vote that same afternoon. Dane was suspended pending investigation, and security walked him off the executive floor while employees watched quietly through the glass walls. Nobody looked shocked, just disappointed, like somewhere underneath it all, people had sensed for years that the story never quite added up. After it was over, I sat alone in what was now my office for almost an hour, just staring at the skyline. I'd actually helped design that space years ago, long before Dane turned it into a shrine to himself. For over a decade, I'd walked those halls pretending my presence didn't matter, watching someone else claim a life I'd built with my own hands. I thought exposing the truth would feel like winning. Instead, it just felt quiet, heavy, like finally setting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten how tired I was. Over the next week, Dane called constantly. First furious, accusing me of humiliating him and wrecking the company's reputation. Then desperate, bringing up family and loyalty and everything we'd survived growing up together. Anything to get sympathy now that the illusion protecting him was gone. He left one voicemail I played back more than once. "You could have handled this privately." I almost laughed. I tried handling it privately for 11 years. I stayed quiet through the interviews. I sat through the family dinners. I accepted smaller titles and smaller rooms inside a company I built, hoping he'd eventually do the right thing on his own. It only became public because he pushed it there himself, one lie at a time, until there was nothing quiet left to do. Rebuilding Meridian became my focus after that. I brought back employees Dane had pushed out for challenging him. I repaired relationships with clients worn down by years of dishonesty. Slowly, the culture inside the company started to feel like something honest again. My family reacted the way you'd expect. Some apologized, a little awkwardly, once they realized how much their favoritism had cost me. Others avoided the conversation entirely, because admitting the truth meant admitting their own part in it. And for the first time in my life, none of it really touched me the way it used to. I stopped needing their approval to know what I was worth. If there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's this: when people silence you long enough, you start mistaking that silence for your identity. You start believing your job is to stay small so everyone else can stay comfortable. But silence was never who I was. Sometimes strength just means walking back into the room where people tried to erase you and simply refusing to disappear. So tell me, what would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have confronted him at that gala, or waited like I did for the right moment? Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one meant something to you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I read every single one.